Okay, so that's recording. Okay, so if I just pick up and say, well, this is actually a good example of where it's not sufficient to simply build the technology and assume it will solve all the problems right away. How's the video there? Is that any better?
That was all fine.
Okay. I think we just go for it.
Yeah. Do you want to just check your OneDrive so that it's not, is it connected to OneDrive?
It's, yeah, it is.
You can tell it to stop synchronizing.
You mean, oh, I see. You mean not a Ring Central thing, you mean overall?
I mean overall, yeah, sorry, on your...
Yeah, how do I do that? Pause syncing?
Yes.
Pause syncing for 2 hours. Okay.
Because what it'll be doing is, as well as trying to route our video, it'll be then trying to send it all again back to the cloud storage as well. So
yeah,
you'll have several simultaneous outward streams.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Good idea. All right. Yeah. Should we start again from the top then?
Yeah. Let's try again. Sorry, I just.
No, that's all right.
If that was how it had saved, it would have been quite distracting.
Okay.
Okay. Are we ready to go again?
Yep.
Okay. Hello, this is Marcus Jones from TRL, and I'm here today with my colleagues George Beard and Shaun Helman to talk about what transport might be like in the future and how we can get there. For decades, the transport choices available to us, cars, buses, bicycles, trains, planes, and feet, have remained broadly similar in principle, apart from improvements in engine technology. There has, of course, been big changes in the use of those different modes, with increases in the use of private cars at the expense of more sustainable modes. But this has been driven by social and economic change rather than by technology per se. People travel much further and make journeys that they didn't used to. However, this has severe environmental and social impacts. New technology, like electric vehicles, can reduce the environmental impacts of existing modes, and autonomous vehicle technology has the potential to make road transport safer and more inclusive. New technology also offers new mobility options, including completely new modes of transport, such as e-scooters, that may allow completely different travel patterns in the future. There's clearly a lot of expectation placed on new technology to solve our problems, but is this realistic? Today I want to consider two questions then. Can new technology deliver its promised benefits unless we also change people's behaviour? And what can we do with behavioural change alone? I'll turn first to George Beard, who's head of new mobility at TRL and has a background in psychology and human factors. George, as a behavioural scientist, considering first the adoption of electric vehicles, what are the main challenges to ensuring they deliver significant carbon savings?
Well, this is actually a good example of where it's not sufficient to simply build the technology and assume it will solve all the problems right away. We think that electric cars have actually been around since the 1880s. I think the first production electric car was built in 1884 in London. And subsequent reductions in oil prices and companies like Ford coming along to pioneer mass production techniques ultimately led to internal combustion engine vehicles capturing the mass market. Now EVs are having a resurgence, and we're seeing rapid growth in sales across the UK and globally, particularly in the last few years. But overall, the share of the total vehicle park that is electric is still quite small, around 1%. So we have a long way to go.
So what are the barriers to the adoption of electric vehicles?
TRL has been researching consumer adoption of EVs for around a decade, and most recently we led the Consumers, Vehicles and Energy Integration Project, in which we ran some real-world trials of battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles with mainstream consumers. And from this work, we know that the key barriers to adoption can be broadly categorized into, firstly, financial, and primarily that's about upfront purchase cost, which is a clear barrier, but also the reduction in running costs or total cost of ownership can also be a motivator to adoption. Secondly, we have functional factors, and this relates to things like the utility of the vehicle, including the classic range anxiety issue that we know about, but also other things like charge time and availability of charging infrastructure, vehicle size and payload. And then thirdly, attitudinal factors, which is something often overlooked, I think, but it's very important, as ultimately cars are an emotional purchase for consumers. They carry symbolic meaning, which is reflective of our image and identity. And these attitudes ultimately influence our likelihood to adopt.
Indeed, and furthermore, shifting to a plug-in car will require behavioural change, doesn't it? Instead of refuelling very convenient at a petrol station, users will have to plug their vehicle into a socket. That'll be affecting how they plan their journeys, won't it?
Yeah, it's easy to forget when you are embroiled in the industry that all the technologies and services associated with operating an electric car seem simple and commonplace. But really, for the average mass market consumer, knowledge and awareness of EVs and the charging technologies required to power them is still not quite where it needs to be. And behavioral science tells us that we must make it as easy as possible for consumers. And at the moment, EVs are simply not the easy option. And so to reach mass market adoption, we need to overcome these barriers. And because of the broad range of barriers, a holistic approach to policymaking is needed. We've recently done some work for the Department for Transport, setting out a range of policy ideas which could be implemented to achieve this aim.
People always talk about EVs as zero emission, but we mustn't forget the life cycle carbon emissions, must we?
Yeah, that's right. And broadly speaking, it's more carbon intensive to manufacture an EV than an equivalent petrol or diesel vehicle because of the battery. And whilst fully electric cars are zero emission at the tailpipe, the only way to really maximize the potential emission savings is if they are charged with renewable energy. For example, recently there's a fantastic publication by Polestar, the EV brand owned by Volvo, which demonstrated that it costs around 14 tons of carbon emissions to produce the petrol XC40, I think it was, but about 24 tons to produce the electric Polestar 2. When considering emissions during use of those cars, the XC40 produces around 41 tons, but the emissions of the Polestar vary depending on the energy used for charging. So from 15 tons, assuming the current European power mix, for example, to just 0.4 tons if assuming wind power only. Now, clearly, there's a lot of assumptions which are underlying those calculations, but at the least as an illustrative exercise, it's quite powerful. And really what it tells us is that electric cars are just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And that's why the energy and transport industries are now coming together in a concerted and coordinated effort.
Indeed, and it might be supposed that internal combustion engine cars will simply be replaced by electric cars and everything else stays the same, with people making the same journeys as before. But is that realistic? Is that going to be sufficient to deliver the carbon savings and other environmental benefits that are required?
Certainly not realistic in terms of solving our climate and air quality problems and delivering the net zero commitment by 2050. In fact, I think I would regard it as a complete failure if the entire fleet of around 39 million internal combustion engine vehicles on the roads in the UK was simply replaced by 39 million EVs. I mean, as we discussed earlier, an EV can't be regarded as entirely zero emission, even if we decarbonize the electricity system, as there are still substantial emissions associated with manufacturing. There's also debate about whether we have sufficient supply of resources like cobalt to produce the batteries, and there are challenges with ensuring an ethical and equitable supply chain. EVs still produce some local emissions during operation as well due to the wear of brakes and tyres, and those emissions are still harmful to public health. And then also we still have a problem with congestion in our cities and towns, and so electrification of the entire fleet won't help with that.
So how do we deal with those wider impacts as well as decarbonising transport?
Well, I think I see this in terms of two steps. Firstly, we must materially alter the way we move ourselves and our goods around, shifting away from motor vehicles and onto more sustainable modes, in particular active travel. And then secondly, we must electrify as many miles as possible for all the remaining trips where motor vehicles cannot be replaced by an alternative.
So how are we going to encourage people to change how they travel? What other modes should we be encouraging?
Yeah, there's a current consultation going on at the moment for the Highway Code, which refers to this principle of the hierarchy of road users. Um, and here, the road users who have potential to do the greatest harm have the greatest responsibility to reduce that danger or threat to others. And so the hierarchy places vulnerable road users before motorised vehicles. So at the top of the hierarchy would therefore be pedestrians and cyclists, and motor vehicles would be at the bottom. For me, this hierarchy not only has an application in safety, but also for mapping modal share priorities. We need walking and cycling to be the first choice for all journeys. And this links back to my point about making it as easy as possible for consumers. At the moment, the easy choice for most journeys is the private car. And so for most journeys, that's the method that people will use. And so through a combination of infrastructure improvements and new technologies and services and policies, we need to shift people's decision making so that the right modes are prioritized. Can I walk? If not, how about cycling? Okay, then next down the list might be a shared e-scooter and so on. And only once other more sustainable options have been ruled out should the private car be considered. And ideally then that car should be electric.
So what about new technologies like e-scooters and new services like mobility as a service? How can we be sure that they'll make a difference?
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting time for the sector, but there are a lot of unknowns. For e-scooters, for example, their safety has not yet been robustly evidenced, nor has their potential to elicit positive mode shift away from cars. There's some evidence emerging from other countries, but really it's important to understand in the context of the UK. And at TRL, we've undertaken some off-street tests of e-scooters to understand their braking and stability performance, for example. But really, we need to examine closely their use in real-world environments, mixing with traffic and using existing infrastructure. And so the trials that are taking place in the UK at the moment are really a critical source of data, which is greatly needed to fill this gap.
Okay, thank you very much, George. And now I want to turn to autonomous vehicles and the behavioural implications of those. Shaun Helman, who's one of TRL's chief scientists, has been giving quite a lot of thought to this. So Shaun, how important is driver behaviour in improving road safety?
Yeah, hi. I mean, that's a really important question. I mean, we know that behaviour is really important as a contribution to safety. But interestingly, that doesn't mean it's not really the only thing that we need to change to improve road safety. So even though it's often cited as the dominant factor, it's not the only thing we need to change. In fact, the prevailing wisdom is that we really need to think about safety as a system. So whole safe roads, safe vehicles, safe speeds, that's the traditional way of thinking about this. Effective post-crash response, and the management of all of that needs to be taken into account. And really the central philosophy is that we know people make mistakes, but the solution is not only to minimize the number of mistakes, it's to accept that the mistakes will still be made and design the system accordingly.
So where do autonomous vehicles fit in here? What further benefits would they deliver in safety?
Yeah, well, the way this is usually thought about is that what AVs can do is remove most of the mistakes that people make, especially those which we characterize as behavioural. So the sort of bad choices that people make, like drinking and driving, or driving while tired, or following too close, all that kind of stuff. And also, you know, the performance mistakes that people make, like missing a motorcyclist at a junction, or, you know, whatever. So, you know, if we assume that the sensor suites on AVs will be better than those of human drivers, those kinds of mistakes can be dealt with as well as those kind of behavioural ones that I talked about.
But long before we get to fully autonomous, fully self-driving cars, we're still going to see changes from greater connectivity between human-driven cars, aren't we?
Yeah, so I think connectivity and automation are both, you know, in the mix here. I mean, those of us who are working in the sort of real world test beds for these kinds of technologies at the moment are sort of settling on the idea that if a vehicle can use data from other sources, other pieces of the infrastructure, for example, well, that's a good thing because it extends the range of that vehicle's awareness. So, seeing around a corner to effectively know that a red light is on a pedestrian crossing, for example. But I suppose in all of this, we need to remember that it goes back to what George was saying. Without a proper consideration of how people are going to use this technology, all we get is new problems to solve, right? So we're fairly sure that autonomy and connectivity can help road safety, but like any new technology, they introduce new issues that we haven't yet predicted, and that's why it's important that we manage that carefully.
One issue, of course, is that while autonomous vehicles might drive more safely with other cars because they can detect them more easily and communicate with other vehicles, but where do pedestrians and cyclists fit into this?
Yeah, and that for me is one of the biggest questions, actually. I mean, it goes back to thinking about new mobility as a whole, because automated vehicles, if we implement them properly, they're going to be a major enabler for that new mobility that George and you were discussing just now. But that has huge relevance to safety as well, because if AVs can't interact safely with the rest of the new mobility mix, we run the risk that they just become the default. And that would be awful because we need active travel in that mix as well. Again, it comes back to the safe system approach. So in short, the abilities of vehicles to detect pedestrians, cyclists, and others needs to be good enough. And when the sensors fail or other mistakes get made, the safe system approach comes into play. It has to be forgiving of mistakes by robots as well as humans.
So what does the solution to detecting vulnerable road users look like then?
Well, I'm no engineer. It depends, I think, who you speak with. I think some manufacturers are assuming that camera-based systems are going to do everything. Others are assuming, as I said earlier, that you need other bits of the infrastructure to help. And I guess for vulnerable road users, you can imagine all kinds of connected solutions. It's simple apps, turn on an app so an automated vehicle knows you're there, that kind of thing. That would seem sensible.
But will pedestrians and cyclists want to be connected in the same way as cars? Is it reasonable to expect them to carry around a device so that they can be detected and be safe?
Oh, I would argue that they're already connected because they all have smartphones, pretty much. So, in that sense, they're ahead of the motor vehicles because not all motor vehicles yet have that connectivity built in. And again, it comes back to making sure that whole new mobility mix is attractive and safe in all of its parts.
What about autonomous vehicles replacing buses and other public transport? Might that make traffic and congestion worse if travelling by an autonomous car by yourself is much more convenient?
Yeah, another great question. And it's about any new technology, automated vehicles, electric vehicles, whatever, they're not the silver bullet. They have to be part of that overall mix. And that would be a tragedy if we end up with automated vehicles that are just the go-to for everybody for every trip. Again, that's just not going to be sustainable. So we need to find a way of mixing them into that wider system.
If people don't physically drive the car, will this change their emotional response to car ownership? People might be less interested in owning a car if they never drive it themselves. They won't get the benefit of performance, or the control features that are advertised. Would other factors become more important in how prestige is perceived?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, we know that if people purchase a vehicle, they make that decision on the basis of a range of attitudes. So there are the kind of affective or emotional attitudes that people might have, how happy they feel with that particular product, and when they drive it, for example. There's the sort of instrumental factors that people care about. So things like the range of the vehicle, the size of the boot, that kind of stuff. And there's also the kind of symbolic attitudes that people attach to this. So how does it make me look? Does it make me look like somebody who cares about the environment, for example? That's a big push for EVs, of course. And I'm guessing that, those are still going to be relevant for future ownership of automated vehicles. So you can imagine instrumental attitudes are still going to be important. People don't buy vehicles they don't buy bad products if they're given the choice. And similarly, if people are accessing them as services, they don't buy bad services if they have the choice. symbolic and sort of effective attitudes, I think, are a little bit more tricky. But my prediction is that they will still be important. They'll just be different ones. So many effective attitudes now are about, as you say, the pleasure of driving. In the future, maybe it's going to be things like comforts and luxury, that are going to be more important for the consumer. One other thing we need to mention, I think, in this discussion, of course, is motion sickness. So you're more likely to experience motion sickness if you're not driving, and people don't like really feeling ill. Prestige doesn't really mean a lot if you're feeling seriously ill because you've just had a particular journey in an AV. Now, of course, the final thing to say, I think, is people will still want to drive, but in a complete autonomous new mobility future, maybe they won't be able to, and maybe driving will become a thing that they do in theme parks.
It's a very, very interesting point to end on there. So thank you, Shaun, and also thank you, George. So in conclusion then, clearly technology offers us greater benefits in improving safety and in reducing emissions. However, that technology will only deliver the promised benefits if it's used appropriately. So we'll need to be supported by changes in road user and consumer behaviour. And we mustn't rely solely on that technology either. There's still a great deal that can be achieved through changes in the choices people make when travelling and when buying vehicles. And we need to ensure that the highway environment, the cost of transport, the cost of different services and their availability, that all of those things all support people in making the safe and sustainable choices. So thank you very much for listening this afternoon.
Great, nice one. I'll stop the recording.